Willow Creek Rescue Shelter stood at the edge of town, forgotten by many, a silent witness to the lives that passed it by. The old building, with its worn-down wooden beams and weathered roof, was an overlooked haven for animals, those too often left behind by the world. The shelter was quiet, too quiet, and the air inside smelled of dust, dampness, and an odd kind of despair that seemed to linger in every corner. And inside one of the furthest pens, separated from the other dogs by a high chain-link fence, lay a malnourished German shepherd. His name was Atlas, though, to him, names didn't matter anymore. In the corner of his kennel, with his back pressed against the cold metal bars, he curled himself into a tight ball. His coat was thin and matted, streaked with dirt, his ribs visible through the coarse fur. His eyes, once vibrant with life, were dull and vacant, as if they had seen too much to believe in anything anymore. Atlas had been found weeks ago in an abandoned farmhouse. He had been left behind, chained, hungry, and desperate. For days, he had survived on rainwater and scraps of food that had been too few and far between. The neglect and cruelty that had become his reality had transformed him into a shadow of the dog he once was. The trauma had cut deep, and no matter how much care the shelter staff provided, they couldn't seem to break through the wall that Atlas had built around himself. No one knew what had happened to him in those weeks, but the emotional scars were evident in the way he reacted to the world. At first, the staff tried to approach him with food, with gentle hands, but Atlas recoiled from every attempt. His body was stiff with fear, his tail never wagging. His eyes were empty, distrustful. It wasn't just his body that was broken, it was his spirit, too. Shelter workers whispered among themselves, frustrated and heartbroken. They had seen animals come in, broken in spirit, but never one as closed off as Atlas. No amount of coaxing, no soft words or familiar gestures could pierce his protective shell. He wouldn't eat in front of anyone, wouldn't take treats, and wouldn't let anyone get close enough to offer him comfort. He was a puzzle, an enigma, and each failed attempt to connect with him only deepened the mystery. There were those who thought perhaps he would never recover, that perhaps his trust in humans had been forever lost. Still, the shelter staff never gave up entirely. They cared for him, fed him, and cleaned his kennel, but the distance remained, a space too wide to cross. One afternoon, as Atlas lay in his usual corner, a new sound entered the shelter. The soft, rhythmic thud of footsteps, approaching slowly and deliberately, broke through the monotony of silence. The door to his pen creaked open, but this time the usual jangle of keys and the shuffle of feet didn't send him into a panic. Instead, the air seemed to shift, and for a moment something shifted in Atlas too. The woman who stepped into his pen was different from the others. Her presence was quiet, calm, and unassuming. She wasn't here for Atlas. She had come to adopt a cat. Riley Bennett, a soft-spoken woman in her early 30s, worked part-time as a librarian in a nearby town. Her life, like the shelter, was often overlooked, mundane and ordinary. Yet, there was something deeply compassionate about her, a gentle spirit that was drawn to the unspoken pain in the world. As Riley passed by Atlas's pen, she felt a strange pull. It wasn't the same kind of bond people often spoke of when they saw a dog for the first time. It wasn't love at first sight, nor was it pity. No, it was something different, something quieter, something that made her pause. She stopped walking and, without thinking, lowered herself to the ground in front of his kennel. Her gaze met his, and for a moment time seemed to slow. Atlas didn't react, didn't even twitch. But Riley remained there, sitting on the cool concrete floor, her book still clasped in her hands. She didn't try to reach for him. She didn't speak or offer him a treat. Instead, she opened the book and began to read aloud, softly, slowly, as if the words themselves were meant to fill the silence between them. The shelter workers watched from a distance, curious at first, then perplexed. Atlas hadn't so much as lifted his head to acknowledge her presence, But something in the stillness of the moment spoke volumes. They'd never seen him this calm before. Day after day, Riley returned to the shelter, sitting in front of Atlas's kennel, reading aloud. She read stories, poems, and even the occasional chapter of a novel. It wasn't about the words themselves, but the act of being present. Atlas still didn't show signs of affection or trust, but he started to change in subtle ways. The first was the faintest shift in his posture. He no longer tensed at the sound of Riley's voice. Slowly, over time, he began to eat his meals when she was around. The tension that had once held his body in a rigid knot began to loosen just a little. For the first time since his arrival, the shelter staff began to notice something that resembled hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Riley's quiet, steadfast presence seemed to be the one thing that was slowly coaxing Atlas back from the brink of his inner darkness. As the days passed, Riley couldn't help but feel a sense of connection growing between them. She didn't know how or why, but something about this dog, this broken, distant dog, spoke to her. She had never been one to push or force affection, but with Atlas, she felt that if she just kept showing up, if she just kept reading and being there, something might shift. Riley Bennett had never expected to find herself back at Willow Creek Rescue Shelter. She had come in search of a cat, a companion for her quiet, solitary life. She had never imagined that the dog with the sad eyes and broken spirit would become her focus. Yet, here she was, day after day, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor of the shelter, reading aloud to a dog that refused to acknowledge her presence. Riley wasn't sure what had drawn her to Atlas in the first place. It was almost as if an invisible thread connected her to him. She had heard the staff talking about him. A German shepherd, malnourished and traumatized, left in a corner, untouched by any kind of kindness for weeks. They had made little progress with him, and most of them had resigned themselves to the fact that this dog might never trust again. Riley wasn't so sure. There was something in his eyes that called to her, something that said he hadn't given up, even though the world had long ago given up on him. It was a quiet, subtle pull that she couldn't ignore. She found herself returning to the shelter every day, the routine becoming a comfort to her. She didn't have to interact with him, didn't have to force anything. All she had to do was show up, read her books, and sit in silence. And so, day after day, she read. She read about places she had never been, distant lands, and grand adventures. She read stories of love, loss, and redemption. She read poetry with its rhythm and rhyme, its ebb and flow of emotions. She read aloud as if the words themselves were a lifeline, connecting her to something beyond the quiet walls of the shelter. But it was also something more. The stories weren't just for her. They were for Atlas. Somehow, she believed that if she kept reading, the walls that Atlas had built around himself would slowly crumble, even if it took time. As the days passed, Riley noticed small changes in Atlas. He no longer flinched when she sat down in front of his spot. His eyes, which had once been dull and lifeless, began to show a flicker of curiosity. His body, still thin and frail, would occasionally shift, moving closer to her as she read. The change was subtle, but it was there. Riley didn't rush it, though. She simply let it unfold, trusting that in time, Atlas would find his way. One afternoon, as Riley sat reading a particularly moving passage from a novel, she heard a soft sound from the corner of the pen. It wasn't much, a soft shuffle of feet, the faintest rustle of fur against the concrete. But it was enough to make her pause. She looked up slowly, her heart skipping a beat, when she saw Atlas sitting just a few feet from her, his eyes trained on her face. Riley smiled softly, her fingers gently turning the page. She didn't say anything at first, not wanting to disrupt the fragile moment. Instead, she continued reading, her voice steady and calm, letting the words fill the space between them. For the first time, Atlas didn't retreat. He didn't pull away into his corner. Instead, He sat there, listening. The moment felt significant, though Riley couldn't fully explain why. She had been to the shelter countless times, and yet today felt different. She felt a shift in the air, a quiet understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, Atlas was beginning to trust her. Not because she was forcing it, not because she was trying to heal him, but simply because she had been there day after day, offering him her presence without expectation. As the days passed, the pattern remained the same. Riley would return, sit on the cold floor, and read aloud. Atlas, at first wary and distant, slowly began to respond. His tail twitched when he heard her voice. His ears, once flat against his skull, began to lift slightly in her direction. The small signs of life that Riley had hoped for started to emerge, faint but undeniable. At the same time, something began to shift within Riley, too. She had always been a quiet person, content with her own thoughts in the quiet solitude of her life. But now there was a sense of purpose in her days. Each visit to the shelter became a reminder that she wasn't just passing time. She was making a difference, even if she couldn't fully see it yet. Riley didn't need Atlas to change overnight. She understood that healing was a slow process. It wasn't about forcing progress, but about giving him space to heal at his own pace. And Atlas, in his own way, was healing. He was still distant, still uncertain, but yet with each passing day, the signs of his gradual transformation became more apparent. He began to eat in her presence, though he still refused to eat when anyone else was around. His body, once rigid with fear, began to relax, ever so slightly. The tension in his shoulders eased, though it would take time for the deep scars of his past to fully fade. Riley knew that Atlas wasn't the only one being healed in this quiet exchange. She, too, was finding something she hadn't realized she had been missing, a connection, a bond that didn't require words, but only presence. She had come to the shelter seeking a cat, but she had found so much more. She had found a way to be present with a dog who had long ago given up on trust, and in doing so, she was beginning to rediscover a piece of herself that had been dormant for far too long. For Riley, the shelter had become more than just a place to visit. It had become a place of quiet healing, both for Atlas and for herself. The days turned into weeks at Willow Creek Rescue Shelter, and each visit Riley made felt more like a small ritual than just a routine. The bond she was slowly building with Atlas, though still fragile, had become something that filled her with a quiet sense of purpose. Every time she sat down on the cold floor, book in hand, there was a subtle shift in the air. Atlas's presence seemed less like a heavy weight and more like a shared silence between two souls who had both been broken in their own ways. Riley was learning to read the small changes in him, the barely perceptible shifts that to anyone else might have seemed insignificant, the way his ears twitched when she began reading, the faint way his eyes followed her movements, though his body still lay curled in the corner, distant and guarded. The most noticeable change, however, was the fact that he was eating now. Not in large quantities, and not with any real enthusiasm, but the food was disappearing. That was something. The shelter staff, watching from afar, couldn't help but be curious. They had all given up on Atlas, convinced that his trauma was too deep to overcome. Yet Riley kept returning, kept reading her stories. In her silence, she was doing what they had not been able to do. She was giving him something no one else had: patience, consistency, and time. There were mornings when Riley doubted herself. She'd arrive to find Atlas still huddled in his corner, his eyes clouded with distrust, his body still tense with fear. But every day she showed up. She read to him, quietly, without expectation, without pressure. The words flowed out of her like a soft river, winding through the silence of the shelter, creating a bridge between them that neither of them fully understood yet, but both could feel. One day, as Riley sat in her usual spot, reading aloud from a book of short stories, something happened that made her pause as the sound of a soft, almost imperceptible breath broke the rhythm of her voice. Riley stopped mid-sentence and looked up. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then she saw it. Atlas had moved. Just a little. His head was lifted slightly, his eyes not quite meeting hers, but no longer avoiding her either. It was such a subtle movement, but to Riley, it felt like a breakthrough. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to scare him, didn't want to break the fragile connection that had begun to form. So she simply resumed reading, her voice steady and calm. But inside, she felt a spark of hope, a feeling that perhaps Atlas was finally starting to trust her, starting to believe that he was safe. Weeks passed in this quiet dance. Riley kept reading, and Atlas kept listening. He had started to eat more regularly, though he still didn't approach anyone else. He was still skittish around the shelter staff, still wary of any attempt to interact with him beyond the silent moments he shared with Riley. But it was enough. In his own time, Atlas was slowly coming back to life, piece by piece. One afternoon, as Riley sat in her usual spot, reading aloud a particularly moving poem about healing and resilience, something extraordinary happened. Atlas, who had been curled up in the corner of his pen as usual, suddenly stood up. Riley's voice faltered for a moment, the words on the page blending into a blur as she watched Atlas take a hesitant step toward her. His body was still thin, but there was a new energy in the way he moved, a tentative curiosity that hadn't been there before. Riley held her breath, unsure of what would happen next. Would he retreat? Would he run back to his corner in fear? But Atlas didn't run. Instead, he took another step, then another, until he was standing just a few feet away from her. His tail, though still held low, twitched slightly. His ears flicked in her direction. For the first time, he wasn't avoiding her. He was approaching her. Riley could hardly believe it. Her hands trembled as she put the book down on the ground, but she didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, her gaze soft and encouraging. She didn't want to rush him. She knew that after all of the trauma Atlas had been through, this moment was huge. One of those rare, fragile breakthroughs that had the potential to change everything. Atlas stood there for a long time, as if contemplating the next step. The tension in the room was palpable, but Riley didn't speak, didn't make any sudden movements. She simply waited, as she had every other day. And then, in an almost imperceptible motion, Atlas took one more step forward. This time, his head was raised a little higher, his body a little less rigid. It was as though, in this small act, he was saying that he wasn't completely broken, that there was still a part of him willing to believe in connection, in kindness, in trust. Riley's heart swelled with emotion, but she remained calm, her voice low and steady as she whispered, "Good boy, Atlas. It's okay. You're safe." The words seemed to reach him. He stayed there for a few moments longer, and then, without warning, he turned and walked back to his corner. Riley didn't chase him. She didn't try to stop him. She simply sat there, watching as he settled down again. His body still tense, but no longer as rigid as it had been before. It wasn't the breakthrough she had hoped for, but it was something. It was progress. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Riley couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. The journey with Atlas was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. The walls that had surrounded him for so long were beginning to crack, and in their place, the possibility of a bond, fragile, delicate, but real, was starting to take shape. Riley didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would keep showing up. She would keep reading, and slowly, piece by piece, she would help Atlas find his way back from the darkness. The days blended into weeks, and Riley's visits to Willow Creek Rescue Shelter became an unbroken rhythm in her life. The other animals in the shelter, with their wagging tails and eager faces, had long ago learned the routine of the place, but not Atlas. He was still an enigma, still distant, still fearful, still a ghost of the dog he had once been. And yet there was progress, small, slow, and often imperceptible, but it was there. Riley had begun to understand the language of Atlas's silence. She had learned to read the small changes in him, the way his tail would twitch ever so slightly when she entered the room, or how he would lift his head a little higher when her voice reached his ears. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her keep coming back. She had started to believe that healing wasn't a grand, dramatic event. It was a series of tiny, almost invisible steps, and Atlas was taking them, even if it took time. That morning, as Riley arrived at the shelter, she noticed something different. To say, for the first time in days, Atlas wasn't curled up in the farthest corner of his pen. He was standing at the front of his kennel, his body slightly tense, his gaze fixed on her. He wasn't avoiding her. He wasn't retreating into the shadows. He was simply waiting. For what? Riley wasn't sure. But she couldn't deny that it was a sign. Something had shifted, and she had to be there to witness it. Without thinking, she walked toward him, slowly, deliberately, her steps soft against the floor. She didn't want to startle him, didn't want to risk undoing whatever progress had been made. She paused a few feet from his pen, kneeling down to his level, and began to speak in a soft, calming voice. "Hey there, Atlas," she said, her words gentle and steady. "How are you doing today?" And for a moment there was silence. Then, just as Riley had hoped, Atlas took a small step forward. His movements were still cautious, unsure, but they were also deliberate, as though he were testing the waters. His eyes were focused on hers, no longer clouded with distrust, but not fully trusting either. Riley held her breath. This was a big moment, one that could go either way. But instead of pulling away, Atlas moved closer. His body was still tense, but it wasn't as rigid as before. Riley could see the conflict in his eyes. His instincts told him to stay away, to retreat, to protect himself from potential harm. But something in him was reaching out. Something deep inside was beginning to recognize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't in danger anymore. Riley stayed perfectly still, not wanting to rush him. She didn't reach out to touch him, didn't try to force any connection. She just sat there, kneeling in front of him, speaking softly to him as if they had known each other for years. "You're safe here, Atlas. You don't have to be afraid anymore." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, a promise that Riley didn't know if Atlas fully understood. But she believed them. She believed that healing wasn't something that could be rushed or forced. It had to come in its own time, on its own terms. And Atlas wasn't ready to let go of his fear just yet. But that didn't mean he wasn't trying. As the days passed, Riley's routine continued. She kept reading to him, just as she had been doing for weeks. The books, the stories, the poems, they had become a part of their unspoken language. And Atlas, though still reluctant to fully trust, began to show more signs of progress. He no longer retreated to the back of his pen when she arrived. Instead, he would stand at the front, waiting for her. Sometimes he would even sit, watching her with a quiet intensity, as if he were trying to figure out the mystery of this woman who had been so patient with him. One afternoon, after several weeks of silence, Riley decided to try something she hadn't dared to do before. She had been waiting for Atlas to come to her on his own terms, but perhaps, she thought, it was time to take a small step forward. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a treat, one of the small, soft biscuits the shelter staff had given her to offer to the dogs. "Do you want a treat, Atlas?" she asked softly, holding it out in the palm of her hand. "It's okay. You can take it." Atlas hesitated. His eyes flicked from the treat to her hand and then back to her face. His body was still, and Riley could see the inner conflict playing out in his mind. He wanted the treat. She could tell by the way his nose twitched and the way his eyes lingered on the biscuit. But he also wanted to be cautious, to make sure he wasn't being tricked, that this wasn't another attempt to hurt him. Riley didn't rush him. She simply held the treat steady in her hand, allowing him to make the decision on his own. And after what felt like an eternity, Atlas took a small step forward, then another. His nose twitched as he sniffed the treat, and for the first time he didn't pull away. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out and, with a soft exhale, took the biscuit from her hand. Riley's heart soared. She couldn't contain the smile that spread across her face, even though she knew this was just one small moment in a much larger journey. But it was a breakthrough, a step forward that neither of them had expected. "You're doing so well, Atlas," Riley whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." It was just a treat, just a small moment in the grand scheme of things, but to Riley, it meant everything. Atlas was beginning to trust her, and with each passing day, he was reclaiming a piece of himself that had been lost for so long. As Riley stood to leave, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Atlas had taken another small step toward healing. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and that was all she needed to keep coming back. The road ahead was still long, but Riley knew this much. She would be there, as long as Atlas needed her, to read, to sit in silence, to offer him the one thing he had never had, patience. Riley sat quietly in the corner of the shelter's office, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. The sound of the dogs barking softly in the distance barely registered in her mind as she replayed the recent moments with Atlas over and over again. The breakthrough, him taking the treat from her hand, had been monumental, but there was still so much about him that remained a mystery, so much about his past that she didn't understand, and it nagged at her. For weeks, Riley had seen the subtle changes in Atlas, his cautious approach, his increasing trust, the flicker of hope that had begun to burn in his eyes. But despite the progress, there were still deep scars within him that no amount of reading or quiet presence could heal. Atlas wasn't just a traumatized dog. He was a dog with a history she knew little about, and she couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him. What had broken him so thoroughly? Riley couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to know. She had to understand what Atlas had been through to make him this way. The thought consumed her as she sat at the desk, staring at the computer screen in front of her. She knew there were records on every animal at Willow Creek Rescue Shelter, including Atlas. His history, his microchip information, as everything was stored in the system. She pulled up his file, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before she clicked open his records. What she found made her heart skip a beat. Atlas wasn't just any dog. He had a past, one that was far more complicated than she could have imagined. His microchip listed a name, Lieutenant Marcus Hale. The name sounded familiar, and as Riley read further, she realized why. Marcus Hale wasn't just a name on a sheet of paper. He was a Marine, a veteran who had served in Afghanistan, a veteran who had lost both of his legs in an IED blast. The connection was undeniable. Atlas had been more than just a companion. He had been a service dog, part of a veteran therapy unit. Riley leaned back in her chair, trying to process the information. This dog, this broken, fearful soul, had been part of something much bigger, something heroic. He had been a part of a man's life, a man who had relied on him for support and strength. And then, one day, Atlas had simply disappeared. According to the records, Atlas had vanished during a transport from one facility to another. It seemed that somewhere along the way, the two had been separated. Marcus Hale had never stopped searching for his dog, never stopped wondering what had happened to Atlas. The file mentioned how the Marine had suffered emotionally from the loss, unable to move forward until he knew what had happened to the dog who had been his lifeline. Riley felt a pang of sadness as she read through the details. Atlas's journey wasn't just one of neglect, it was one of loss, of separation from the person who had mattered most to him. Riley could only imagine what it must have been like for Atlas, torn from the only source of comfort and stability he had ever known. The thought lingered in her mind for hours after she closed the computer. She had to do something. She couldn't let Atlas's story remain incomplete. She had to find Marcus Hale. She had to help reunite them if it was possible. There was no way Riley could ignore the connection between Atlas and Marcus. They had both been through so much. But now, it seemed, they might have a chance to heal together. Riley's heart raced as she pulled up Marcus's contact information. She hesitated for just a moment before dialing the number. She wasn't sure what she would say or how he would react. Would he even want to see Atlas again? Would he be too afraid to reopen the wounds of their past? But she had to try. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. It was a deep, gravelly voice, roughened by years of hardship, but still carrying a sense of warmth beneath it. "This is Marcus," the voice said, and Riley felt a sudden lump in her throat. "Hi, Marcus," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Riley Bennett. I'm reaching out because I have some information about Atlas. It says the dog you were looking for." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and Riley could hear the sound of Marcus shifting, perhaps in his chair. "Atlas?" he asked, his voice low, tinged with disbelief. "Are you telling me you found him?" Riley nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm at Willow Creek Rescue Shelter. I've been working with him, trying to help him heal." "He's here, Marcus, and I think he remembers you." The silence stretched on for a long moment. Riley held her breath, waiting for him to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Are you sure?" he asked, his words heavy with hope. "I never thought I'd see him again. I never stopped wondering what happened to him, but I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to bring him home." Riley's heart broke for him. She could hear the pain in his voice, the years of missing his loyal companion. "I'm sure," she said gently. "He's here, Marcus. He's safe. And I think he's ready to see you again." There was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. I don't know what to say," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This means everything to me. I've never given up on him. I never will." Riley felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I can arrange a visit," she said softly. "I think he's ready, Marcus. I think it's time for you two to be together again." The next few days were filled with anticipation. The shelter staff, who had watched Riley's quiet efforts with Atlas, were amazed at the breakthrough. They, too, could sense that something significant was about to happen. Riley had made the arrangements with Marcus, and soon the reunion that had seemed impossible would take place. Riley didn't know what would happen when Marcus and Atlas finally came face to face. But she did know one thing. This was the moment they had both been waiting for. The dog who had been lost, and the man who had never stopped searching for him. Together, at last. The day of the reunion arrived, and the air at Willow Creek Rescue Shelter was thick with anticipation. Riley had spent the last few days preparing for this moment. She had arranged everything, the room, the setting, and the timing, carefully, wanting to ensure that the reunion between Atlas and Marcus was as smooth as possible. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel a nervous excitement. What if it didn't go as planned? What if Atlas didn't recognize Marcus? What if the wounds of the past were too deep to heal? Riley stood by the shelter's front door, looking out the window. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over the parking lot. But it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. Her heart pounded as she waited for Marcus to arrive. It had been a long time since Atlas had seen him. Years, in fact. But Riley believed that this was the moment that could change everything for both of them. At last, a car pulled into the parking lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. Riley's heart skipped a beat. It was him, Marcus Hale, the man whose name had appeared on Atlas's microchip, the man who had never stopped searching for the dog who had been his loyal companion. Riley stepped forward as the car came to a stop, watching as Marcus emerged from the vehicle. He was wearing a navy blue jacket, his movements deliberate, and his posture somewhat stiff. His face was weathered, but there was a quiet strength about him, an undeniable presence that made Riley's heart ache. Marcus stood still for a moment, scanning the area, as if he wasn't sure what to do next. His gaze landed on Riley, and the recognition was instant. Riley smiled gently and stepped forward. "Marcus," she said softly, "thank you for coming." He gave a small nod, his expression guarded but hopeful. "I didn't know what to expect," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I knew I had to come. I couldn't let another day pass without seeing if it was him." Riley nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She could feel the tension in the air, a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I think you'll be surprised," she said gently. I think Atlas is ready. He's been waiting for you." Marcus swallowed hard, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "I've waited so long," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, Riley led Marcus into the shelter, her steps measured and careful. The closer they got to Atlas's pen, the more Riley could feel the anticipation building between them. She could see Marcus's eyes, darting from one kennel to the next, as if searching for a sign, any sign, that Atlas might be there, waiting for him. And then they reached it. Atlas's pen was in the back corner of the shelter, away from the hustle and bustle of the other animals. Riley paused for a moment, giving Marcus a chance to steady himself before opening the door to Atlas's space. As soon as the door swung open, Riley's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel Atlas's presence before she saw him. He was curled up in his usual spot, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed as if lost in thought. "Atlas," Riley said softly, her voice calm and soothing. For a moment nothing happened. Atlas didn't stir, didn't even lift his head. Riley turned to Marcus, her gaze reassuring. "Just take it slow," she advised. "Let him come to you." Marcus nodded, his hands slightly trembling as he slowly moved toward the pen. His eyes never left Atlas. Riley stood back, giving them space, but she could feel her heart racing. As she watched the scene unfold, would Atlas recognize Marcus? Would the trauma of their separation be too much for him to overcome? Young Marcus stopped, just a few feet from Atlas's pen, kneeling down to his level. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering just above the ground as if afraid of startling the dog. "Atlas," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's me. It's Marcus. I'm here. I've come for you." For a long moment there was silence. Atlas remained still, his eyes locked on Marcus, but his body remained tense, his ears flat against his head. Riley held her breath, willing Atlas to remember, to respond in some way. She knew how much this meant to Marcus, how much it meant to both of them. And then something shifted. Slowly, Atlas's ears pricked up, and he began to move. He didn't rush toward Marcus, but there was a hesitation in his movements that told Riley he was processing, remembering. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity before Atlas finally stood up. His legs were still weak, still shaky, but his steps were deliberate. And then, like a dam breaking, it happened. With a soft whine, Atlas bolted forward. His tail wagged, tentatively at first, and then more vigorously. He took several quick steps toward Marcus, his eyes wide with recognition. The moment their eyes met, the connection was undeniable. Atlas's body language softened, and he stopped just a few inches away from Marcus, his face burying itself in the man's chest. Marcus gasped, his hands trembling as he wrapped his arms around Atlas, pulling him close. Atlas responded with a soft whine, pressing his head against Marcus's chest, as if he had finally found the person he had been waiting for all this time. The room fell silent, save for the soft sounds of the reunion. Riley stood at the door, tears welling up in her eyes, as she watched the two of them. She had never seen anything like this before, this raw, unfiltered moment of recognition and reunion. It was a moment of healing, of reconciliation, and it was everything she had hoped for. For what felt like hours, Marcus and Atlas remained like that, holding each other as if afraid to let go. The bond between them, once severed by fate, was now restored. "I never stopped looking for you," Marcus whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I never stopped hoping." Atlas's tail wagged again, his body pressed against Marcus's, as if to say, "I never stopped waiting." Riley stepped back, her heart full. She knew this wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Healing had begun, and though it would take time, they would walk through it together. The reunion between Atlas and Marcus had been nothing short of miraculous. The bond that had once been broken had been mended. In a moment of raw emotion and recognition, it was as though the years of separation had melted away, leaving only the pure connection between man and dog, one that transcended words, time, and distance. Riley stood back and watched the two of them, her heart swelling with happiness for both of them. She had witnessed the painful journey of Atlas's healing, but seeing them together again, it was clear that the true healing was just beginning. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus finally pulled away from Atlas, though not far. The dog's body was still pressed against him, and Marcus's hands gently stroked the fur on Atlas's back. His face was a mix of relief and joy, as though he had finally found the missing piece of himself. Atlas, too, was calmer now, his tail wagging softly as he rested his head against Marcus's chest. Riley took a step forward, careful not to disturb the moment. She had given them the space. But now, she felt it was time to let the next step unfold. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said softly, breaking the silence. Marcus turned to her, his face softening as he smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "I can't believe it," he said quietly. "I thought I'd never see him again. I thought—" He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion, but Riley understood. Words weren't necessary. They both knew how much this moment meant. Riley nodded. "It's like he's been waiting for you. I've never seen him respond to anyone like this." Marcus's eyes softened as he looked down at Atlas, who seemed to sense the deep emotion in his voice. The dog's body shifted slightly, as if to get even closer to Marcus. The two of them shared a quiet understanding, the kind that only comes from years of companionship and trust. Then, with a deep breath, Marcus stepped back a little, giving Atlas some space. "Come on, boy," he said softly, his voice low but firm. "Stand by me." The command was simple, one that Atlas had once known well. It was the command that had been a part of their bond, the foundation of their work together in the therapy unit. Riley held her breath, watching the interaction closely. Would Atlas remember? Would the command trigger a response, or had too much time passed for him to recall? For a moment, Atlas stood still, his head slightly tilted, his eyes searching Marcus's face as if processing the words. Riley could see the wheels turning in the dog's mind. There was hesitation, just a brief flicker of uncertainty. But then, like a switch being flipped, Atlas's posture changed. His body stiffened, his muscles tensed, and in one swift movement, he leapt forward, bounding toward Marcus with an unmistakable sense of purpose. It was as if a floodgate had opened. Atlas ran toward Marcus, his legs strong and sure, and when he reached him, he immediately planted himself at Marcus's side, pressing his body against his leg. His tail wagged furiously, and he let out a soft whine, as if saying, "I'm here. I'm back. I remember." Well, the sight was enough to bring tears to Riley's eyes. She had known that Atlas's healing wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about emotional and psychological healing as well. In this moment, this simple command had opened the door to something profound. Marcus bent down slowly, his hands gently resting on Atlas's head. "You did it, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're back." Riley watched in awe as Marcus continued to praise Atlas, gently stroking his fur. Atlas responded with soft whines, his head rubbing against Marcus's hand, seeking the connection he had so longed for. Riley had seen the transformation in Atlas from the moment she first started visiting the shelter, but now standing here, witnessing this reunion, she saw something more. She saw hope, not just for Atlas, but for Marcus too. Both of them had been through so much, and yet, here they were, together again, beginning the long process of healing. For a few minutes, the three of them simply stood there, in the silence, Atlas nestled at Marcus's side, the two of them finding their rhythm again. There was no hurry. There was no rush. The reunion had been a long time coming, and there was no need to rush through the moments of reconnection. Riley took a step back, giving them the space they needed to continue their quiet reunion. After a while, Marcus straightened up, a look of quiet determination on his face. He turned to Riley, who had been standing off to the side, watching them. "I want to take him home," Marcus said, his voice steady, but with a deep undercurrent of emotion. "I don't care how long it takes. I'm not leaving without him." Riley nodded, her heart swelling with pride for both of them. "I think that's a great idea," she said, her voice soft but full of conviction. "But Marcus, it's not just about taking him home. It's about building a new life together. You've both been through so much, and now you get to start over. One step at a time." Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes never leaving Atlas. "I'm ready," he said, his voice filled with a quiet strength that Riley hadn't heard before. "I've been waiting for this day for so long. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to help him heal. We'll do it together." Riley watched as Marcus and Atlas stood side by side, both of them changed, stronger, more resilient than they had been before. She knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for them both. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But with patience, love, and the bond they had once shared, they would find their way back to each other, one step at a time. The door had opened, and now there was no turning back. The days following Atlas and Marcus's reunion passed in a haze of new beginnings and quiet moments of rediscovery. For Marcus, bringing Atlas home wasn't simply about having a dog again. It was about reclaiming a piece of his life that he had lost when the dog disappeared. Marcus had survived the most harrowing of battles overseas, but it was Atlas who had been his anchor, his lifeline during those dark, turbulent years. And now, with Atlas back by his side, the healing process had truly begun. The house Marcus lived in wasn't much, a modest, single-story home on the outskirts of town. But to Marcus and Atlas, it was everything. It was a place where they could rebuild, where they could find peace in the simple rhythms of everyday life. Atlas had always been more than just a dog to Marcus. He had been a partner in a mission that transcended the battlefield. He had been the calm in the storm, the unwavering presence that had kept Marcus grounded when the world around him was falling apart. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself falling into a new routine, one that included Atlas in every moment. They would wake up early, the dog always eager for their morning walk. They would go to the park, where Marcus would throw the ball, and Atlas, even in his older age, would chase it down with the same energy he had displayed in their younger days. The connection between them was tangible, the years of separation now seemingly irrelevant as they rediscovered their bond. But it wasn't just about the walks or the quiet moments in the house. Marcus began to feel something stirring inside him, a need to do more, to give back, to help others who might have been through similar struggles. He knew that Atlas's journey wasn't just his own. It was a story that could help others. It had been years since Marcus had thought about public speaking. When he was still in the military, he had given talks on resilience, on recovery, on the strength it took to overcome the darkest moments in life. But after losing Atlas, he had lost the drive to share his story. Now, with Atlas back at his side, Marcus felt the pull to reignite that mission, not for himself, but for others who needed to hear that healing was possible, even in the most broken of circumstances. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Atlas's head resting on Marcus's lap, Marcus found himself looking at the phone. He thought about the local schools, the veterans organizations, the hospitals. He thought about the countless people who needed to hear the story of a Marine and his dog, how they had fought together and had, in the end, found their way back to each other. "I think it's time," Marcus muttered to himself, more to Atlas than anyone else. Atlas, as if on cue, lifted his head and looked up at Marcus with those deep, knowing eyes. It was as if the dog understood exactly what Marcus meant. He had always been there, always understood when Marcus was struggling, always seemed to know when a change was coming. The next day, Marcus contacted a local veterans organization, a group dedicated to helping soldiers and their families reintegrate after service. He told them about Atlas, about how the dog had been an integral part of his healing journey. The response was overwhelming. They had heard of Marcus before, of his service and his strength, but they had never heard the story of Atlas, the dog who had been there through it all. It wasn't long before Marcus was invited to speak at a veterans event, a gathering of soldiers, families, and supporters who had been through similar battles. The event was held at a local community center, and as the day drew closer, Marcus began to feel a mix of excitement and nerves. Speaking in front of a crowd wasn't something new to him, but speaking about Atlas, about the journey they had shared, was different. This time, it wasn't about the military or the battles he had fought. This time, it was about something more personal, something far more emotional. On the day of the event, Marcus and Atlas arrived early. The room was already filled with veterans and their families, the atmosphere heavy with stories of hardship and perseverance. Marcus could feel the weight of their experiences, and he knew that his words, his story, would resonate with them in a way nothing else could. As he stood in front of the crowd, Atlas sitting calmly beside him, Marcus took a deep breath. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the podium, but his voice was steady as he began to speak. "My name is Marcus Hale," he said, his voice clear and strong. "And I want to tell you about my dog, Atlas. You see, Atlas was my partner. He was my lifeline when everything else felt like it was falling apart. When I lost him, I didn't just lose a dog. I lost my sense of purpose. But what I didn't know was that the moment I found him again, my purpose was restored. Atlas and I, we're not just survivors of war. We're survivors of loss, of heartbreak, of trauma. And together, we're showing the world that healing is possible." As Marcus spoke, he saw the faces in the crowd soften. He saw the nods of recognition, the tears in some of their eyes. Atlas, who had been sitting at Marcus's side, seemed to sense the impact of the moment. He stood up, walked slowly to the edge of the stage, and sat down, his gaze fixed on the audience. It was as if he was showing them that, just like Marcus, he too had endured and triumphed. Marcus continued, his words pouring out now, as though Atlas's presence had unlocked something deep within him. "I know what it's like to feel like you've lost everything. I know what it's like to feel alone, to feel like you'll never get back to where you were. But I'm here to tell you that healing doesn't happen in one big moment. It happens in small steps, in the quiet moments, when you realize that you are not as broken as you thought. It happens when you find the strength to keep going, even when it feels impossible." The crowd was silent as Marcus finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He knew that their journey wouldn't be easy. None of their journeys would be. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. He was sharing not just his story, but Atlas's story. And in doing so, he was giving others the hope they needed to keep fighting, to keep moving forward. As Marcus stepped down from the stage, Atlas by his side, the applause from the crowd was overwhelming. It wasn't just for Marcus, it was for the bond between man and dog, for the story of redemption and resilience that had touched each and every person in that room. Atlas, as if understanding the significance of the moment, wagged his tail and trotted up to Marcus. nuzzling his hand in quiet affection. Together, they had begun something that would touch lives far beyond the walls of that room. Their mission was reignited, not just as survivors, but as beacons of hope for others who had once lost everything. The event had been done overwhelming success. Marcus and Atlas's story had touched the hearts of everyone in that room. The veterans, the families, the supporters, they all felt the power of the bond between the man and his dog. It wasn't just about survival. It was about healing, rebuilding, and the quiet resilience that comes with a deep connection. As Marcus stood at the front, answering questions and engaging with the crowd, Atlas lay peacefully at his side, the dog's calm presence speaking louder than words ever could. But as the event drew to a close and the crowd slowly began to disperse, Riley stood at the back of the room, watching the scene unfold. She felt a deep sense of pride for Marcus and Atlas, but she also felt something stirring within her, a realization that her journey had only just begun. She had come to Willow Creek Shelter to help one dog, to offer him her quiet presence and her voice, but seeing the power of Marcus and Atlas's story, seeing the healing it had sparked in others, made her realize that she, too, could play a role in something much bigger. For the past few months, Riley had felt a deep connection to the shelter, to the animals she had met there, and to the people who had walked through the doors looking for help, looking for a second chance. She piped in. He had always been the quiet, introverted librarian, someone who found peace in the solitude of books and quiet corners. But something about the shelter, something about Atlas's journey, had awakened something within her that she hadn't known was there. After the event, Riley found herself reflecting on her time with Atlas, on the ways in which she had quietly helped him find his way back to trust, to hope, and to healing. She thought about how small, consistent actions had made such a difference. Sitting with him, reading to him, offering her presence. These simple acts had created a bond that had blossomed into something profound. But Riley knew that there were other dogs in need, other animals that needed someone to show up, to be there, just as she had been for Atlas. She couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward this work. It was clear now that her calling wasn't just about helping one dog. It was about helping many. The idea began to form slowly, but as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore. Riley wanted to create something that could bring the healing she had witnessed with Atlas to more dogs in need. She wanted to create a program, one that would connect traumatized dogs with people, using the power of presence, reading, and quiet companionship to help them heal. She wanted to create a space where both animals and people could find peace, where they could rediscover trust, and where they could learn to heal together. She began to share the idea with the shelter staff, her voice filled with excitement and determination. "What if we could create a reading program for the dogs?" she asked. "Something that pairs people with the animals who were struggling the most. People could come in and read to the dogs. No pressure, no expectations, just being present with them, offering them the same kind of quiet companionship that worked with Atlas." The staff at Willow Creek was intrigued. They had seen the difference Riley's presence had made with Atlas, and they were eager to support her vision. Together, they began to plan out the details of the program, how it would work, who would participate, and how they could get the word out. Riley threw herself into the planning, feeling a new sense of purpose that had been missing from her life before. She named the program Pages and Paws, a name that reflected the connection she hoped to create between people and animals through the act of reading. The concept was simple. People would come to the shelter and spend time with the dogs as reading aloud to them. The idea wasn't to train the dogs or to work with them in the traditional sense. Instead, the goal was to provide them with the calming presence of another person, someone who could offer them comfort, even in silence. Soon, the program was up and running. The first group of volunteers, mostly people from the local community, arrived, eager to participate. Riley had carefully selected a few dogs who had shown signs of trauma or fear, and she introduced them to the volunteers one by one. The participants would sit with the dogs, their voices calm and steady as they read aloud. Some of the dogs responded immediately, their bodies relaxing as they listened. Others, like Atlas, were more hesitant, unsure of what to make of the situation. But each of them seemed to find something in the rhythm of the reading, a quiet comfort, a sense of stability in the presence of another. Riley watched as the program grew. More people began to sign up. More dogs began to open up. The shelter became a place of quiet healing, a space where the trauma of the past could begin to fade, replaced by the calming presence of a person who simply showed up. And with each passing week, Riley saw the difference it made, not just for the dogs, but for the volunteers too. Many of them, like her, had come looking for a sense of purpose, a way to give back. And through their time spent with the dogs, they found something they hadn't known they were missing. A connection, a way to heal themselves. As the program flourished, Riley couldn't help but think back to the day she had first walked into the shelter, unsure of what she could possibly offer. Now, seeing the results of her work, seeing the way the dogs and volunteers were beginning to heal together, Riley knew that this was her true calling. She wasn't just helping the dogs. She was helping the people too. She was creating something bigger than herself, a space for healing, for connection, and for hope. One afternoon, as Riley watched a volunteer sitting in the corner with a dog on her lap, reading aloud, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The path she had chosen had led her here, to this moment, to this program, and it was exactly where she was meant to be. Months had passed since the launch of Pages and Paws, and the program had flourished beyond Riley's expectations. What had started as a small idea, one born from her quiet observations of Atlas's healing journey, had blossomed into a full-fledged initiative that was making a difference, one dog and one person at a time. The shelter had transformed into a place not just of rescue, but of healing, a sanctuary for both animals and humans seeking to recover, rebuild, and rediscover trust. Riley watched from the doorway of the shelter's reading room, her heart swelling with pride as she saw the latest session in progress. A young boy, no older than 10, sat cross-legged on the floor, his book open in front of him. Beside him, a nervous but curious golden retriever lay quietly, its head resting against the boy's leg. The boy read aloud, his voice wavering at first, but growing steadier as he continued. The dog, once skittish and fearful of human contact, now lay relaxed, its eyes closed, breathing deeply in time with the rhythm of the boy's voice. The quiet moments in the room spoke volumes. Here was a dog who had been given the gift of patience, the gift of presence, and in return, he was giving the boy the comfort of connection. Riley smiled softly to herself. This was what she had dreamed of when she first conceived the idea of the program. It wasn't about the dogs being trained to perform tricks or learn commands. It was about giving them the space to be themselves, to heal at their own pace, and to trust again. And in turn, the humans who came to read to them, volunteers, families, children, found that the act of giving their time and presence wasn't just helping the dogs. It was healing them too. As she turned away from the door, Riley's thoughts drifted back to Marcus and Atlas. Their story had inspired so many, not just in the shelter, but in the community as well. The impact of their reunion had spread far beyond Willow Creek, and Marcus had become an advocate for veterans, for healing, and for the special bond between service animals and the people they served. He had continued speaking at events, sharing his journey, and Atlas had remained by his side, the perfect symbol of resilience and loyalty. Riley had visited Marcus and Atlas several times since their reunion. She had witnessed their bond grow stronger with each passing day. Marcus was finding a new rhythm in his life, one that included not only his advocacy work, but also more quiet moments with Atlas. Those small, everyday gestures that spoke volumes about the depth of their connection. And Atlas, who had once been so distant, had now become the joyful companion Marcus had always needed. One of Riley's favorite moments was watching Atlas interact with the children at local schools. Marcus, along with Atlas, had started visiting schools to speak with children about the importance of compassion and resilience. During these visits, Atlas would sit calmly while the children pet him, learning the value of trust, patience, and empathy through their interactions with the dog. Riley had seen the way the children responded to Atlas, how they instinctively knew to approach him gently, to respect his boundaries. They were learning not just about animals, but about themselves. They were learning about quiet healing, about the power of presence, and about how small acts of kindness could change the world. It was a beautiful thing to witness, and Riley couldn't help but feel proud of the ripple effect that had been created. What had started as a simple program in a small shelter had sparked something much larger, a movement of healing, of connection, and of hope. Riley's work had become a testament to the quiet power of presence and the healing potential of unconditional love, not just for animals, but for humans as well. But even as the program flourished, Riley knew that there was still more to be done. She had begun to think beyond the walls of Willow Creek, considering how the Pages and Paws program could expand to other shelters, how it could reach more communities, and how it could touch even more lives. She had become more than just a volunteer at the shelter. She had become a catalyst for change, an advocate for the quiet power of connection. One afternoon, as Riley sat in her office at the shelter, reviewing some new volunteer applications, she received a phone call that would change the course of her work. It was from a local university, where a team of researchers had been studying the impact of animal-assisted therapy on trauma recovery. They had heard about Pages and Paws, and wanted to collaborate to explore how the program could be expanded into a full-fledged therapeutic model. Riley felt a rush of excitement mixed with a tinge of uncertainty. This was it, the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to take the program to the next level, to turn it into something that could not only help dogs and people on a small scale, but could also have a lasting, measurable impact on trauma recovery. She spent the next several weeks working closely with the university's team, fine-tuning the program and gathering data on its effectiveness. The results were astounding. Volunteers who participated in the program showed significant improvements in their mental and emotional well-being, and the dogs, many of whom had been deeply traumatized, showed signs of increased confidence and reduced anxiety. The research demonstrated what Riley had known all along, that the power of presence, the simple act of being there for someone, could heal even the most wounded hearts. The partnership with the university opened doors to new funding, new resources, and new opportunities to expand the program. Riley began traveling to other shelters, training staff, and spreading the message of Pages and Paws. The program took off in ways she had never imagined, reaching communities far beyond Willow Creek. But as Riley's work expanded, she never forgot the heart of what had made the program so successful in the first place. The quiet moments of connection, the small acts of kindness, the simple, unspoken bond between a person and a dog, that was the legacy of Pages and Paws. Not just the healing of animals, but the healing of people, one story at a time. And so, as Riley watched Atlas and Marcus interact with a new group of children at a local school, she couldn't help but smile. It was a quiet moment, but it was one full of meaning. In that moment, she realized that this was exactly what she had set out to do, to create a legacy of quiet healing, to show the world that sometimes the most powerful change happens in the stillness of a moment.